Hello everyone, my name is Damien with the DevSec Blueprint, and I'm so happy to provide you with the first technical video on how to stop your developers from creating vulnerable resources within AWS using CloudFormation hooks. Let's talk a little bit about the main reason why we need to implement this type of control in AWS specifically. Based on the research that I've done in the past and things that are most commonly missed, misconfigurations is one of the top issues in cloud security today. And these misconfigurations are quite frequent in nature. Misconfigurations are essentially deemed as, for example, I have an S3 bucket that I created that I know isn't supposed to be publicly exposed, but I ended up enabling it somehow. That's a part of the misconfiguration. It's a very small change that has a massive impact because it introduces vulnerabilities into our environment, and it also introduces a backdoor into our environment because people can come in and exfiltrate our data. There are various different types of misconfigurations in AWS, and with the use of CloudFormation hooks, we can prevent those from happening, which in a sense increases our overall security posture and structure. Before we start developing our infrastructure, there are two things that I require of you. Number one, you need to have the AWS CLI installed. The links to install the packages for various different operating systems are in the description, as well as, and this is optional, but I'm actually going to make it a requirement, you definitely want to install VS Code, and the link to that is in the description as well. When you're installing VS Code, the reason why I say VS Code is a requirement is because I need you guys to understand that we're going to be writing the CloudFormation templates from scratch, and I definitely want you guys to have an IDE that will allow you to be able to create these CloudFormation templates. So without further ado, let's head on into our IDE and let's start building. Let's get directly into just understanding the basic terminology and defining what a CloudFormation hook is. So I actually have this article up that was written by a community builder that I thought was fantastic, and I'll drop that link in the description once we finish building out our infrastructure. But the first thing that I wanted to cover is just give you guys an overview of what a CloudFormation hook is and how we can use it. So if you don't understand AWS and you understand the concept of guardrails, there are two types of guardrails that AWS supports. One of them is preventative guardrails and the other one is detective. In this sense, AWS CloudFormation hooks really falls underneath the preventative category. And as it says, preventative guardrails enforce specific policies to help ensure that your accounts operate in alignment to compliance standards and disallow actions that lead to policy violations. So if you take a look at CloudFormation hooks, in a sense, CloudFormation hooks are preventative guardrails, and it is basically a service or a feature of a service that allows the users to invoke custom logic to automate actions or inspect resource configurations prior to a create, update, or delete of a CloudFormation stack operation, which is exceptionally good for us because, in a sense, if you're trying to automate anything or any infrastructure creation with CloudFormation, you can use those hooks as a way to pretty much confirm that these resources are being created in the right way, right? So at a very high level, that's exactly what a CloudFormation hook is. And let's just dive into the basic terminology, which if we scroll down, there's several different terms that are going to be used for CloudFormation hooks. So you're going to see this a little bit when we start navigating through that console when we're trying to enable our CloudFormation hook. So what is a hook exactly? So these guys defined it as a hook contains code that is invoked immediately before CloudFormation creates, updates, or deletes specific resources. And this hook in itself is able to inspect those resources that are created by the CloudFormation template. And what happens is that if they don't comply with the guidelines or the specifications of the hook itself, or the specifications that have been put in the CloudFormation hook, they are able to prevent that CloudFormation template from being able to provision or create those resources. So it's basically stopped there and it's errored out. And you're actually going to see that with the project that we're actually going to build. So hook targets are the destination where hooks will be invoked against. So typically what you do with a CloudFormation hook is that you specify a target. You can specify a specific CloudFormation template target or a specific resource in AWS, like an S3 bucket or an EC2, or you can just say, you know what, all resources are affected by this CloudFormation hook. It can be a very generic CloudFormation hook. When it comes down to a target invocation point, So it says the invocation points are the point in the provisioning workflow where hooks will be executed. And it says that CloudFormation supports pre or before invocation point for this release. So that basically means that you can write a hook that targets the S3 bucket or targets a S3 bucket, but it's basically targeting it at the invocation point. The target action or actions are the type of operation hooks that will be executed against, or the type of operation hooks will be executed at. So these actions are basically tied to the hook targets. Those hook targets support create, update, and delete actions. For example, when a hook for a create action on an S3 target is authored, it will only be executed during a create operation for an S3 bucket. So you can target create, an update, or delete, or you can just say target all of them. And most of that is going to happen. And I'm just going to kind of skip down from here and move into the type configuration. But the type configuration is where you're going to configure the majority of these properties for your CloudFormation hook, just so you get an idea of what it's about. And I'm going to skip over this and talk a little bit more about the hooks configuration schema as well. So all hook extension types must have a type configuration schema set to be invoked during stack operations. And there are three types or three parts. So you have the target stacks, failure mode, and properties. So in the target stack schema, you can basically specify whether or not you want to target none of them or all of them. So he says that if the mode is set to off for the target stacks, the hook applies to all stacks in your account during the create, update, or delete operation. And then if it's set to none, then the hook itself won't apply to stacks in your account. So this field tells the service how to treat hook failures. If the mode is set to fail, then the hook fails, then the fail configuration stops provisioning resources. If the mode is set to warn and the hook fails, then the warn configuration allows provisioning to continue with the warning message defined in your hook logic. So you can either basically specify it to fail and then it'll just fail before the resources are provisioned, or you can set it to warn and the resources will still get provisioned, but that warn message will be in the logs when those resources are provisioned. So for the stack, if the security professional comes in and they look and say, why was this created or why is this given a warn message? It's because the hook was set to warn them, but they have, those resources created in a specific area in AWS. And then properties, you can basically define encryption settings as a property and various other different kind of configurations as well. But I think that in this particular article they just highlighted that because it was dedicated just for their specific use case, which is where they were basically creating a hook for a S3 bucket. So with the type configuration, it says that AWS CloudFormation supports hook type specific configuration, which can be used during setup by hook users. The CloudFormation service will refer this configuration at runtime when it is executing hooks in an account. So the hook configuration supports enabling or disabling the hook at the stack level, failure mode, and hook runtime property values. So when you look at this, again, it's similar to how what was specified here in a hook configuration schema. So most of this really doesn't change. It's just the exact same thing, but in a JSON form. So in a sense, and you can see here, you can specify the properties here. And what it says is that for the properties specifies hook runtime properties. These should match the shape of the property supported by the hook schema, and the hook authors define the runtime properties in the hook schema. So as an author, I can define those properties if I really need to in the schema itself. And then it also says you can identify property definitions and if they are required by examining the hook schema under the type configuration. So you can see here in the properties, they basically set the limit size to 1 for one creation of the S3 bucket, which was the example that they used here for the demo. And then also the encryption algorithm for that S3 bucket, which should be leveraging KMS itself. So we've covered some of the basic terminologies of CloudFormation hooks. Now that we've finished going over the terminology, let's start building. But the first thing is that you guys need to configure your AWS CLI. So I'm going to drop this link into the description because this is where you're going to be able to configure that CLI for whichever system that you have, whether it be a Mac, Windows, Linux. AWS has that documentation for you to be able to configure that. And you're going to have to configure it because what we're going to be doing is we're going to be enabling a CloudFormation hook that will disallow us from creating EC2 instances that have SSH enabled for anyone. So go ahead, get this configured, and then we'll start building. All right. So for me, I've configured my AWS CLI already to be able to point to my account. So what I'm going to do now is we're going to create our file, and we're going to actually start off with our first file, which is going to be CloudFormation YAML. And what I'm going to name it is SSH enabled all instance dot YAML. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new file and I'm gonna save it in my directory. And I'm gonna get rid of the source control. And here, so we have a blank CloudFormation YAML file. Every CloudFormation YAML file, the bare minimum that needs to be included must be the resources key. So what I'm gonna do is put resources in here. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to put the name of the resources. So I'm going to say the name of the resource, the AWS resource is going to be default instance. The type, which is a type that's declared by AWS. But what we're going to do is we're going to put type AWS EC2 instance. And then we need to define the properties for this EC2 instance. And what I'm going to do is specify the properties. So the properties for this is going to be the latest image ID. And what I have to do is that since I want to be able to reference the latest image ID at all times, I'm going to have to create the parameter. So after I create the parameters, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to create the latest AMI ID. The type is going to be SSM parameter. So what I'm going to do is put that there. Sorry, my keyboard is not liking me today. So I'm basically just going to copy and paste this one over here. And then default is going to be here. I'm going to have the AWS Linux AMI. So this is basically an SSM parameter that is enabled by default within AWS. And this is always going to reference the latest Linux AMI that they come out with within AWS, which is super good for us. So now that we've gotten that, I'm going to basically insert exclamation ref here, and then we're going to take the latest AMI ID. So what this means is basically saying that before we create this resource, it's basically going to reference this parameter, which is then going to reference this parameter in SSM, which will have the latest AMI. Next, we're going to have the instance type. So the instance type, again, we're going to reference, well, we're not going to reference it. We're going to just type it in. So it's going to be a T2 micro, which is a type of EC2 instance. Then we're going to have block device mappings. So in this particular case, we have to add in a little in there. And we're going to put the device name, which is going to be the absolute path or mount point for the Linux system. And then we're going to have here, once we've defined that, we're going to have EPS. We have the volume type. And then here, we're going to put 1, which is default volume type for this instance. We have the IOPS. We're going to have default on termination, which is set to false. So if we terminate this, we don't necessarily delete the EBS volume that was once associated with this instance. I probably should set that to true though. So the volume size for this is going to be 20 gigs, so 20 GB. And then lastly, what we need to do is use security groups or security group IDs. So personally, what I do for this is, we're actually going to create another resource. So we're going to create 2 resources. There's going to be one, the default instance, and the other one is going to be the security group right beneath it. But instead of it being beneath it, I'm actually going to put it before it. Or if you have a default security group created in AWS, you can reference it. But in this case, I created one just for this because, again, we're trying to basically block this CloudFormation template once we enable our hook in AWS. So we're going to create this instance security group. The type is going to be of AWS EC2 security group. Then properties And we want to do group description, allow all SSH, because we want to allow anyone to be able to SSH into this EC2 instance. We're going to create the VPC ID for this, which I'm going to put mine in, and you can log into AWS and navigate to the VPC console and grab yours. But that's the VPC ID that I have in my account, which I'm going to deploy to. And then from there, we need to define two different properties. We need to define ingress rules and egress rules. So we're going to do security group ingress. And with this, we're going to have the IP protocol, which is going to be TCP. We're going to allow from the from port, going to be port 22. We're going to have 2 port, which is port 22. Then we're going to do the CIDR IP address, which is going to be 0.0.0.0/0. That CIDR IP is crucial because that CIDR IP lets AWS know and lets the security group know that anyone can connect to it. I accept traffic on port 22 from anyone. Okay. Now, when we get to the security group egress rules, we basically want to be able to allow all traffic from anywhere going outbound, simply for just performing updates and all kinds of system administration tasks on this server. Not like we're going to anyway, but who knows, you may want to do something with your server once you finish spinning it up, if you deactivate the CloudFormation hook after we've activated it. All right, so we've already defined our security group here at the top. So now the next thing that we want to do is we're going to reference this security group. And this is essentially, since it's security group IDs, this key is going to desire a list. So this security group ID does take several security groups, but in this particular case, we are only going to put one. But if you want to put multiple, you would just essentially come here and just add more of those hyphens at the bottom, which is a YAML property, a syntax. So here I'm going to just put in this get attribute, and this attribute is going to reference the output from this resource that is created, which is going to be the security group. And we're just going to put the group ID here. All right. So this is our CloudFormation template, right? This is what we use to be able to deploy everything upstream. And this is what we're going to be using to deploy everything into our account. By default, my AWS CLI is configured to deploy to US East 1, but you can deploy this into any region. I would just advise that the region you would deploy it into, you make sure that you change the VPC ID, or that you ensure that the VPC ID aligns with that one in that region. All right, so we have our first resource. We're going to save this YAML file, and let's navigate on over into the console so that we can enable that CloudFormation, because there's a specific one that needs to be enabled that was developed by the AWS community. All righty, so I'm logged into my account, and the first thing I'm going to do is enable that CloudFormation hook that disallows SSH from being enabled on an instance that anyone could connect to, right? So the first thing we're going to do is, once we've navigated to here, we're going to click on public extensions. We're going to come to hooks, right? And then we're going to go to third party. And when we come here to third party, I'm going to do AWS community and look that up. And then what we're going to do is do this. So what we want to do is we want to enable this hook, which is EC2 security group restricted SSH. And when we come here, we click on this, we are going to enable and activate this by clicking activate. And what we're going to do is we are going to use the default extension name, which is here. And then the execution role ID, we're going to actually have to create our execution role ID. But the good thing about that is we actually have one that we can create in CloudFormation. So before we activate this, let's hop right back over to our handy dandy VS Code editor. And let's create another file. And we're going to call this CFT hooks. And inside of this, we're basically going to define a IAM role for our CloudFormation hooks to assume to be able to do its duty. So I'm going to create this resource parameter, and I'm going to name this the execution role. And then from here, we'll define the type. The type is going to be AWS IAM role properties here. And then we're going to define the role name, which is going to be. And what I like to do is I like to create my role names that have the AWS account ID in it and region, just so that it's, you can easily reuse this template without creating the roles over multiple times. So what I would do is sub, and then you have CFT hooks exec role. And that sub basically stands for substitution of CloudFormation. So what you can do is just sub it for any of the protected keys that they have. And what it'll do is it'll swap it out with whatever the value is within the key. So in this particular case, I have an AWS account ID, and then we have the AWS region. So from here, region, and I'm going to save that. So that's going to have the AWS account ID, my AWS account ID, and the region that I'm deploying to. And then another thing we need is going to be the assume role policy document. So we have 2012, 17, or 10, 17. Then we're going to come here and then we're going to do principal. You have the statement. The effect of the role is going to be allow. We're going to have the principal. And then under the principal, we'll have the service. And then the service, we can pass in multiple services. But in this case, we want to do resources, CloudFormation, Amazon AWS.com. And then we want to do hooks, CloudFormation, Amazon AWS.com. And then once we're done with that, we key back up to, or walk back up to, and then we'll go here and we'll define the action for it, which this action will be STS assume role. So what does this mean? This means that when we create this role, as is right now, these two services will have the ability to be able to assume this role to be able to perform whatever duties that we grant in our policy, which we will actually create in just a second. So I'm going to come back up to assume policy document, and I'm going to go to path, hit that, and then we're going to go to policies, and then I'm going to come here, policy name, CFT hooks, deny all policy, and do policy document. Then we're going to do version, which is 2012, 10, 17. Then we're going to do statements, which is going to be effects, deny. Then we're going to have action, which is going to be star. And then we're going to have resource, which is going to be star. So this is going to be our policy. And basically what's going to happen is that this policy is going to be associated with this role. And what's going to happen is that CloudFormation Hooks is going to be able to assume this role and associated with this with the stack, and is going to be able to deny the stack of everything. So it's basically a deny all policy that we're going to attach to this resource. Now, how do we have this YAML file and create this execution role in AWS for our usage, right? So we're going to come into the stack, and we are going to do AWS, and then we're going to hit enter. What we're going to do is AWS CloudFormation, deploy, and what we're going to do is type in a stack name, which is stack name. So we can come up with the stack name. It's fine. In this particular case, the stack name for me is going to be information, hooks, exec, role. And then what I'm going to do is hit the template file. And then you would basically pass in the name of the template file. So in this case, it's going to be CloudFormation hooks, exec, role.yaml. And because we're creating an IAM resource, we have to tack on hyphen capabilities. And inside of that, we're going to have to put in capability named IAM for the role deployment. So every time you do a role deployment in CloudFormation, it's going to expect this. And because I've already created it, I'm actually going to not hit enter and I'm just going to let you guys see it or hit enter for yourself. At any time, if you run into any issues with this, just do know that I will have this code pushed to my personal GitHub and the link will be in the description for everything with the proper steps on how to create these things. So I'm going to tab out of that. And what I'm going to do is, since I know the name of this role, I'm going to derive this role, which is going to be, just to roll real quick. And because I'm a little lazy, I don't want to type it out. And I'm going to just simply look for this role. Calculation. Oh, there it is. CFN, CFN, CFN. Yep, CFT. So I'm just going to grab this role, get the ARN, and I'm going to come here and I'm going to drop that in there like that. Then put the execution role and the login config, which is optional. I'm not going to put anything in that. Automatic updates, we definitely will include those. And then we want to configure it now once we activate it. So what it's going to do is we're going to activate the extension. And then this is really important. So this is where we start to get into the configuration schema. So it says that specify the configuration properties to be used with the extension in this account and region. The JSON you pass to specify the configuration properties must validate against the configuration schema. So if we make any mistakes to this, it's not going to be valid. It's going to basically let us know that we need to update it. Good thing is we will just keep this configuration set to this, which is going to be CloudFormation configuration, hook configuration. We don't want to specify no stacks at all. So we're just going to specify all target stacks in our account. And then the failure mode is going to be fail because we want to prevent this resource from getting created in our account. So I'm going to leave this as is. So it's activated, as you can see. And now what we're going to do is we're actually going to try to push the CloudFormation template. So I'm going to open up CloudFormation here. As you can see, I have the execution role stack name created there. And we are going to create our stack by deploying it. So here I'm going to say AWS CloudFormation deploy stack name. I'm going to name it just SSH enabled everyone instance. And then I'm going to pass in template file, which is going to be the name of the file. So I'm just going to just copy this name and I'm just going to paste it here. And then I'm going to deploy it. So what's going to happen is, look at that. And we got some issues. So let's look at those issues really quickly. So what I'm going to do is see device name, blah, blah, block storage mappings. Then we got security group IDs, which is, look at that. Look at that. So oops, security group IDs was supposed to be at the top. That was a typo. Sorry about that, y'all. All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to redo this and see if we can get it. So what's going to happen is you can see that it's actually waiting for the change set to be created in CloudFormation. So let's look. So let's go over here and let's look for it. So you can see that it's created in progress. And while this is created, I want to point this out because I found this out a couple of days ago when I was actually writing this. Hooks are enabled by region. It's a regional feature for a regional service. Remember that. So if you try to deploy the same thing for the same resource into the US East 2 or whatever other region you have, make sure you enable the exact same CloudFormation hook in that region. Otherwise, it will create this resource without a doubt. So that was something that I found very interesting and I wanted to point that out. So we see rollback has completed for this particular CloudFormation stack. Let's look at the events. All right, let's look. So you can see at the very bottom, it says it was reviewing it in progress. It created or it started creating progress. The user initiated it. And then we get to the create failed. Why did it fail? It says the following hooks fail. That's the hook that we enabled. Why? Because it prevented SSH from being enabled for everyone for this instance. It was basically saying that it cannot create this instance. So the hook protected us. And you can see here, the hook was invocated at the creation process. And you can see when we click on that, the invocation details, it says the hook complete failed and the fail mode happened. It says this security group ingress got an error because it was a violation of IP addresses of the incoming SSH traffic into the security groups are restricted. Awesome. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to hop back over and fix this by basically setting it to a random IP address that's private, right? So I'm going to come back over here and I am going to duplicate this. So I'm going to copy and paste it. I'm going to do SSH. We're going to say SSH, not disabled. We're just going to say restricted instance. There we go. And since I have all that same, I'm going to leave that exactly the same. And oh, and you can see it also said that it failed here in the CLI. So what we're going to do here is, you see where we have this security group ingress line in the code on line 13. We're going to come here and we're going to just scroll down a little bit. And where we see on line 17, the CIDR IP, we're going to change this. So I'm going to come up with a random IP address because I don't want y'all knowing my actual CIDR for my house. So I'm just going to put, for example, like, let's just say random. So 192.168.1.32/32. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to type in AWS CloudFormation deploy. I'm going to do stack name, and I'm going to say SSH enabled. I'm sorry, SSH restricted instance. We're going to type in the template file, and the template file is going to be the name of the file. So let me just go ahead and do rename, copy, then paste that there, bam, and we're going to deploy this. So I'm going to come over here and it's creating. So you can see that if we scroll down, you can see that the hook invocations were complete. So the hooks were scanned against it and it didn't come back with anything because we weren't allowing SSH from anywhere. So I'm going to sit back and I'm going to let these resources create and we'll be able to just look at it in the EC2 console in just a minute. All right. So came back after about 5 minutes. I looked at this, said, all right. So we refresh it and we have the default instance here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on that. We can just come and see it in the dashboard. It should be spun up and we should see it says available. And voila, it is available with public IPv4 address. And if we wanted to connect to it, we definitely could without using SSH. There are various ways to go about it, but that's the power of CloudFormation hooks. All right, the building session is complete. Thank you guys so much for tuning in and building this with me and learning a little bit about CloudFormation hooks as well as CloudFormation and how to deploy those CloudFormation templates upstream and seeing the CloudFormation hooks in action, which is something that I definitely love. One thing I wanted to mention about CloudFormation hooks is that you can develop your own. The link to that is in the description. Make sure you go through the description and read the documentation on how to be able to contribute your own CloudFormation hook and potentially make it public for the general use within AWS. Remember, CloudFormation hooks are there for you to be able to protect your AWS environment. So please make sure you use them unless you have another security solution that you have implemented like Terraform Sentinel or Open Policy Agent, which are some of the most common ones within the industry. Last but not least, after all that we've done, please make sure that you like, subscribe, make sure you pay attention to the links in the description, and definitely comment. Let me know what you guys think about this video. Let me know if you'd like to see more with CloudFormation hooks or if you'd like to see something totally different. Thank you guys so much for your support. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video.